Hey everybody, I have a special guest on my show. He is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and he has this
Yes.
really great podcast. You should check it out. And I was on podcast before, by the way, and in which he talks with polymaths. And one of the things that Dustin does really great at is understanding personal development and how it connects with polymathy and creativity and things of that nature. I'm pretty sure that this is something that you'll learn a lot from and benefit from. So it's great to have you on my show, Dustin.
Thank you, Leon. As you said, I interview a lot of multidisciplinary people like yourself, and I
Yeah.
super much enjoy it. And you can learn so much from just interviewing people like this.
Right. So can you tell us the connection of polymathy and personal development?
Yeah. So let's think of it in a more linear sense. To start off with the specialist, if you are someone trying to go into a specialty, you're going to learn one thing after another in this sort of sect, right? You have a tree of knowledge, right? You're trying to go through and learn each next thing. You're going to keep moving forward, keep leveling up. And eventually you hit the top of the tree and you can't really go any farther per se. You might be able to branch out a little bit, but that's about it. Polymathy and multidisciplinary, instead of just having one tree, you're having multiple trees, a forest of knowledge, if you will. And then you can branch between them like a little squirrel jumping between different branches. You have this interconnection.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to be a squirrel that has some parkour skills, that's definitely where you want to go. So how do you think people would benefit from this? As in, like, how would be helpful for their own lives to be able to know about this?
Yeah, I think it's really good for anybody to really be multidisciplinary. Like, even if you are a specialist, it's good to have a wide range. It's better to be a T-shaped person, so someone with a specialty and a wide range in a more novice sense, than to be just in one narrow trench. If you are narrow, you can't actually learn from other areas. You can't bring those learnings from those areas into your main area either. And for someone like us, where we don't necessarily have one particular main area, although one is going to probably be stronger than the others at some point or another, you're generally switching between them over years. And sometimes you're focusing more on one, sometimes you're focusing more on the other. But for the most part, they all interrelate as who you are. And as a species, we've always been more of a generalist by nature too.
Yeah.
So I often refer back to David Epstein's book, Range, because it really just has some prime examples, but he has two examples of people who are specialists, right? And in their own fields. So you have Tiger Woods, who's like the definitive specialist who from birth or from toddlerhood was playing golf, essentially, right? And golf is one of those things where there's not very many variables to what you're doing. Eventually, you're going to hit to the point where you've experienced everything there is to experience in golf. Whereas if you're playing cards, for example, there's so much different outcomes with playing cards.
I have not yet experienced hole-in-one yet, but
yeah, I haven't either. But it's just one of those skills that has a limit as to where it can go. And in order to become an expert at it, you have to like really work at refining those small details. Versus something along the lines of like tennis or some other sports where they have a little bit more variety to it and different things can happen. They talk about like Roger Federer, David does in his book, who literally spread himself out so much. Like, he's known as one of the world's greatest tennis players, but he actually did like 15 different sports as a kid.
Wow.
And it's fascinating how he dabbled so many times. He actually preferred like wrestling, I think, for a time, and was probably even going to take that further instead of tennis, but something about wrestling just didn't end up working out, and he ended up moving to tennis and falling in love with that. And because he dabbled, he learned so much from these areas that it made him better at tennis.
Wow. And that's really incredible to hear. I have no idea about that. So can you tell me, like, what is it about that perhaps that he's learned wrestling, he learned other sports, that somehow he has integrated this into tennis?
Well, I can't necessarily speak for Roger Federer. I can guess in the sense of like with wrestling, for example, you have to think about how you can move your opponent. You think about how your body relates to theirs. And if you take that same mindset and put it to tennis, most tennis players aren't going to think about the other player's body. But by taking it from a wrestler's perspective, you're going to think, okay, well, their body is going to be a little bit more weak in this particular stance, or weak after doing this for so long. You could take advantage of those weaknesses when you're playing against that opponent. And it's taking a different strategic mindset from a different sport and applying it to the sport you're actually doing. In my own example, actually, I teach swimming. And one of the things I do is talk about the psychology of swimming, the physicality of it, the physics, and as well as the philosophy. And that three-pronged approach allows me to teach almost anybody how to swim. But I can take that same mindset and apply it to dry workouts, or even just martial arts, or any other kind of sport, because that same three-pronged mindset is distilling it down to the most basic forms.
So have you seen anything about like how being able to act in this multidisciplinary way has benefits the brain?
Well, when you're doing multiple different kinds of skills, it's going to challenge your brain in different ways. That's for one, like right off the bat.
Right.
If you're focusing on one skill, you're only going to be challenging the brain in that one way. And eventually you might get some new neural pathways just because you might learn something new about that skill. Someone taught me something about swimming one day after teaching it for years, that even though I had been teaching it for half a decade at that point, and I was really well knowledgeable in the subject, that one person just taught me something, to look at something differently in one little way, and it changed my direction dramatically. And that can happen in any skill, but you don't necessarily have to have another person to do that. Having another skill set can do that for you, and you can basically do that in your own self-directed learning, that kind of way, their own self-development aspect.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. If you want to really even develop one thing well, it's good to be able to consult someone else about it, or even like go into like a different field and have that field inform you in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, it made me think in one of my endeavors for the modular degree, which is a self-education approach, I talk about skill tree-based learning, where you're branching out between like multiple different ways. And the reason why I talk about that, the reason why I kind of push it, is that this interleaving between those areas, the different nodes, allows you to progress further and further. So sure, you could focus on one pathway and really nail that home, and then switch to the next one and take that sequential approach. That works fine. But having the interleaving back and forth helps keep you more focused for a longer period of time, and it keeps things more interesting. If you lose interest on a pathway, which I know people of the neurodivergent variety will oftentimes happen, where you're hyperfixated on something, then you lose that fixation,
right, exactly.
And you want to switch to something else. It's perfect for people like that when you have this skill tree approach. That way you have an organized structure that's accounting for your multi-interests and multi-pathways.
Right. So like if you are neurodivergent, like you have ADHD, for example, then you are really utilizing your strength here. Like you don't have to do things just like everyone else, but even if like you're like a neurotypical person, there's something to benefit from this. Like if you're able to kind of interweave between different areas.
Yeah, exactly. You get to learn more stuff more often. One of these things I've been toying with as like a blog post I'm going to write here soon is the idea of like serial polymathy or juggling polymathy, like juggling between many different things, and jack of all trades approach, if you will, versus the serial polymath, which is like a specialist who switches specialties every decade or so. Because if you think about it, most people become polymaths by the end of their life anyways, because they've literally worked multiple different jobs, multiple different fields, multiple different hobbies over the course of their life. So by the time they're 80, they've done 4 different skills at least. And it's one of those things where that's why I kind of think about it, but I think it's more effective to do it juggling. Just, you have to do it well. That's the big
thing. Yeah. So I came across this like really great research by neuroscientist Dr. Dario Nardi, and he's been on my show before. But one thing that he shows through his research is that you certainly are born a certain kind of personality type, but then if you enter into a field that's of a different personality type, for example, then the brain like rewires itself in a really significant kind of way.
I have something that can bounce off of that. That's a very interesting point. And I think I've come across either his research or a derivative of it at some point, because it's just interesting to think about how personalities change over time. Like, even though we might be more extroverted or introverted, I'm more of an ambivert. I think I used to be more extroverted when I was a teenager, just kind of wanting to be more introspective. And it's a good thing. It changed me. I was able to focus more on self-development because of that. And I was at home more. But I also feel like it's kind of a balance between back and forth. And maybe in 10 years, I might be like one of the more extreme again. But I think also too, like you're saying, the more external circumstances where you work, it definitely has changed a lot for me too. But it's one of those things where like how your external environment will change your approach and personality.
Right. Yeah, I think it does. Like, I grew up with like pretty severe social anxiety, but like over time I kept practicing a lot of different kinds of social skills. And I feel like it was like a really immense weakness that I had to deal with, like a really big challenge. But like, it's almost as if I was able to buy more and more into that mindset of socializing, and almost like became like really intuitive. Some aspect of it, like learning how to connect with others, I guess my brain just kind of like rewired itself so that I got like a pretty good idea of how to do so.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times people don't realize too, just how much social interaction, or even just being gregarious, if you will, is more of a skill. Like even though I was a very gregarious person by nature, I still had to learn to be that way properly, if you will, without offending people as much or as often at the very least. And also too, just how to approach those situations. So even though I wanted to go approach that person, right, I didn't necessarily know how to go about that, or maybe how to do it well too. And so even for someone like me who comes more naturally, I still had to learn the skill. And I think a lot of people on the introverted side don't realize that even extroverts have to learn how to do it too when it comes to communication or just being emotionally aware.
Exactly. And yeah, that's certainly very interesting. Dustin, now you mentioned about like having the system where you look at these 4 different pillars when it comes to personal development. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah. So alongside the whole self-education frontier, I was also pursuing self-development. And I really keep them relatively separate because they do have a different point, right? Education's more skill-based, whereas self-development's more about your life and the kind of more macro of it. Right. And so I talk about the mind, body, spirit, and emotions. And I see those as the 4 pillars of our life. A lot of philosophies out there might only look at 3 of them or might combine emotions with spirituality or mental. But I often find it keeps us separate to me. So for example, the body is nutrition, health, and exercise, right? You have the mind, which is the conscious and subconscious parts, as well as maybe just like knowing if you're depressed or not, that kind of thing, mental health, if you will. And then on top of that, you have the spirituality. Like, are you religious? Are you spiritual? Or are you just pursuing a better version of yourself? Do you have that grit? Regardless of where you approach spirituality, I felt like it's a part of our lives we need to account for. And then finally, you have the emotions, which kind of interweaves or interwebs, I guess you could say, all the other different pillars. When you are physically more fit, you're going to actually be happier more often, which also changes your physical composition. So your emotions have a physical impact on your body. Like when you're happier, you're more warm. When you're sad, you're more cold. Right. And on top of that, your emotions obviously affect your mental health. Your emotions can affect your spiritual growth as well, and vice versa. They're all connected and they all impact each other.
This is very much influenced by your research into interdisciplinary fields, right? It's kind of like a similar kind of idea.
Yeah. I guess from an outside perspective, I can see why you see that, but I actually, I can't say I came up with, but I distilled this 4 pillars philosophy because I came up with it after learning about yoga or learning about Aristotle's principles and these other philosophers who came before me. But I came out with the 4 pillars as a modern approach to them because I actually did that when I was a teenager. Well before I was talking about polymathy, well before I was talking about being interdisciplinary, although I was naturally more interdisciplinary before I even realized exactly what it was. Yeah. To be fair, I did a project on Leonardo da Vinci back when I was like 7th grade. So like I was already looking into it even as a kid, but still.
What's the way that you find that you've applied this into your own life?
Yeah. So one of the first examples, and I like talking to people about this on the podcasts because when you are approaching the 4 pillars, you can't necessarily do them all at once, even though you really have to. Like I've noticed that you really do have to take into account all 4 areas of your life. But just like with your normal skill set, you have to start from somewhere. You can't just know everything all at once or try to pursue 4 big skills all at once per se. You can start one and then start it and actually get a little progress and then switch. But you have to actually make a little progress first before it actually does anything, before you have the capacity to switch.
You need to like kind of like solidify it.
Yeah, a little bit of concreteness there, if you will. And so, yeah, solidifying it. One of the things I noticed is that most people have their anchor pillar, right? You solidified one pillar more than the rest because that's kind of what you built yourself up on. So for me, I was a really scrawny kid growing up. I was picked on for it even. I was never much that strong. I was never much into sports. And ironically, I flipped the script and went I started taking swimming when I was like 17, 16. And then I became a lifeguard, then a swim instructor, then water books instructor, personal trainer, and went down that physical path and eventually became strong. And now I have much more better physique because of it. But that's my anchor pillar. The body pillar became my anchor pillar. Now, then I had to go out of my way to go teach the brain, learn more, challenge the brain through video games or some other kind of medium, learn more about spirituality. So I think spirituality is one of my next areas in life that I'm going to have to level up. Emotions came actually more naturally just because of my background, but it's one of those things where like everyone has their anchor pillar, and that's the point.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you start off with the anchor pillar that you're building in these other areas. And what do you find like is the benefit of that? Like you have this as your anchor pillar. How did you find that it has helped you along the way?
Well, And I don't think most people approach it in the sense, hey, I'm going to go build up my anchor pillar. But I do think if people could, it's probably a good idea to have something to go have a goal for. But I was talking to somebody last week where literally his anchor pillar was the mind. His only option was to learn more, read as much as he could, and pursue that. And then he actually didn't even realize the importance of exercise so much because he thought it was fruitless or kind of a waste of time. But once you experience exercise, you experience how you feel afterwards, you experience how it makes you feel better. You get that endorphin rush. You actually support the brain.
Right.
And the mind-body connection is very powerful, right? Those pillars are usually first, but it's a matter of how they impact the rest of them. That's where I would say your question would be.
That makes a lot of sense. This reminds me like it's actually beneficial to be able to work on different areas and they actually reinforce each other and help each other out. Rather than detract from one another.
It would be like a good idea to do 20 push-ups before going and take a test, get in enough sleep so your body and brain can have enough rest, get in the right kind of breakfast so your nutrition is on point before going to taking a test and having that mental stress. People don't seem to realize that they all impact your mental performance during the test.
So it's possible to spread yourself too thin, right?
Sure. And I mean, I've definitely done it myself. Even right now, I think I told you last week when we chatted, I haven't been feeling as emotionally hyped or physically ready as I once was. And I think I'm not burning out, I don't think, because I know what that feels like. And I definitely want to avoid that. Right. But it's interesting to think about how whenever you're in a lower state, you're not going to be as productive as you normally are. You're not going to be able to do as many different things. And by doing too many things at once, it can burn you out. And that's the kind of thing you want to avoid. But sometimes by doing so many different things, it actually energizes you to do more. So at one point, when I was in my job, thank you. I was a lifeguard, I was a swim instructor, water bus instructor, fitness attendant, all at once. I had 4 different roles, if not like 5 different roles, all at once. And most people would think, oh, I'm overwhelmed. For me, I was excited. I was like, okay, I have things to do. I have things I can focus my energy on. And by being overwhelmed, it made me more excited to get things done. When I had 2 or 3 jobs, I was more excited to work on PolyInnovator and stuff like that because I had that energy built up.
Yeah. I certainly felt that before. Like once I keep active in different areas, it kind of energizes me. It gets my mind alert and ready.
Well, and kind of bringing things back around to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, the skill tree based approach, like I say, 4 different pathways, each one of those, you're allowing yourself to focus on one as long as you feel interested or willing to do it. Right. There's going to be a point where you're going to hit a plateau and you have to push yourself past that. And I think a lot of people get lazy when they hit those plateaus and they leave too soon. At some point, even though you're not interested in it, you still have to push past it. And that's progress. But disregarding that part, you push until you're done. Like, right, okay, I'm done down this pathway. I want to switch to the next one. By switching, you're keeping your energy high. You're keeping your momentum going. Even though you're switching tasks, you're switching to something else. You're spreading yourself too thin by doing too many different things. You're keeping the momentum going, and that's going to snowball more than just focusing on just one pathway and getting burnt out. Let's say you put down the guitar, but you pick up the trombone or you pick up the violin, which is another string instrument. The violin's a better example where you're playing it in a similar way, but obviously the way you do it is different too, technically. But by making progress with the violin, it's going to teach you something more about string instruments that's going to help you with the guitar. Another example is like push-ups. Push-ups is one of the most basic exercises. You're pushing yourself up off the ground and getting the same motion in the biceps, the pecs, and the shoulders and all that jazz. But let's say you hit a plateau. You can't do any more, or you're not explosive enough, or you don't have the endurance, whatever it may be. Then you go sit on the bench press, where instead of on the ground, you're facing up and you're pushing weight away from you. Right. That change of like pushing away from gravity rather than going towards gravity. Right. Yeah. It's a similar motion, but you're learning how to use the muscles in a slightly different way, and you can take that same aspect and
I see.
Push past the plateau in push-ups is what I was going to say.
Excellent. Okay, so Dustin, so how may we be able to find you online?
Oh, awesome. Thank you. So I go by PolyInnovator on the online space. You could literally search PolyInnovator with 1 L on any platform, and you should be able to find me, as well as you can find me at polyinnovator.space, which is my website. So you can find all the content I make on there.
Dustin, it's a pleasure to have you on my show. I really appreciate this really enriching knowledge that you have.
Thank you, Leon, for having me.